Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to FTA's webinar on risk-based inspections that the State Safety Oversight Agencies will be required to conduct on rail transit agencies pursuant to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. I'm Joe DiLorenzo, FTA's Chief Safety Officer, and I'm excited to share with you an overview of the update to the National Public Transportation Safety Program that now requires SSOAs to develop and implement a risk-based inspection program. We also will provide an overview of the basics of risk-based inspection program, as well as a toolkit we are developing to help the SSOAs as they begin to develop and implement this program over the next several years. Here today with me is Aaron Powell, FTA's Senior Regional Safety Officer, who has been developing FTA's approach to implementing the risk-based inspection program requirement. Aaron, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Joe, thank you very much, and good afternoon to the Rail Transit Agency community. I am happy to be presenting to you the basic requirements mandated by Congress under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for risk-based inspections, as well as lay out the framework of a risk-based inspection program. My goal today is to ensure that all of you have a basic understanding of the updates to the National Public Transportation Safety Program related to risk-based inspections, and to outline for you how FTA plans to implement these requirements. Without further delay, let's get started. I'd like to quickly go over today's agenda. I'm going to provide a background on the risk-based inspection program requirements and outline FTA's definition of risk-based inspections. Next, I'll discuss the agencies that will be impacted by risk-based inspections and how. We will also talk about the major provisions of risk-based inspections as part of the National Public Transportation Safety Program. After reviewing the basics of the law, we will move into FTA's approach to implementing risk-based inspections and how FTA plans to assist SSOAs and rail transit agencies in complying with these new requirements. FTA will issue a special directive to each SSOA and plans to provide technical assistance through an accompanying toolkit. Next, we will talk about the timeline for the special directives issuance and risk-based inspection program implementation. Finally, we will answer some questions related to the program as a whole. FTA is providing this webinar as an introduction to risk-based inspections as required by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. While we are still working internally on the specifics of the program, including the development of the special directive and toolkit. Therefore, I will not be able to provide detailed answers to all questions about areas of the program that are not yet finalized. However, I will provide as much information as I can to ensure that SSOAs and rail transit agencies can begin preparing to develop and implement risk-based inspection programs. Let's start with some background on the new requirements for the risk-based inspection program. FTA has considered risk-based inspections a best practice within the transit industry for some time. However, until Congress passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law on November 15th, 2021, there was no requirement for SSOAs to implement a risk-based inspection program. With the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, FTA must now ensure SSOAs develop and implement a risk-based inspection program. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law also requires that FTA assess each SSOA's capability to conduct risk-based inspections. Further, Congress has directed FTA to issue a special directive to each SSOA requiring them to develop and implement a risk-based inspection program that includes each rail transit system overseen by that SSOA. I know that most SSOAs and rail transit agencies have never received a special directive from FTA, and therefore Later in the presentation, I will spend several minutes explaining special directives to the group and what you can expect. I'd like to start our discussion of risk-based inspections by defining a risk-based inspection program. A risk-based inspection program uses qualitative and quantitative data analysis to inform ongoing inspection activities. Risk-based inspection programs are designed to prioritize inspections to address safety concerns and hazards associated with the highest levels of safety risk. While it seems straightforward, a risk-based inspection program will require SSOAs to use data to inform their inspection practices, with the goal of addressing the highest risk safety elements and conditions. Now that we've covered the requirements and defined a risk-based inspection program, let's look at how the risk-based inspection program will impact the industry. Risk-based inspection programs will be carried out by each SSOA. However, the program places requirements and responsibilities on more than just the SSOAs. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law requires FTA, each SSOA, and rail transit agencies to participate in the national implementation of risk-based inspections. The following 3 slides address some of these requirements. The National Public Transportation Safety Program requires that FTA issue a special directive to each SSOA on the development and implementation of risk-based inspection programs. These special directives must be issued no later than November 15th, 2022. FTA is currently developing these special directives. In addition to issuing a special directive requiring the development and implementation of risk-based inspection programs, FTA is tasked with ensuring SSOAs can meet the requirements of such programs. This means that FTA must ensure the inspection practices of each SSOA are commensurate with the number, size, and complexity of the agencies the SSOA oversees. FTA must ensure the SSOA inspection programs are risk-based, and FTA must ensure that SSOAs have sufficient resources to conduct inspections. As I mentioned earlier, SSOAs are tasked with carrying out risk-based inspection programs that comply with the law. Let's look at the requirements as they pertain to SSOAs. First, SSOAs must have the authority to enter the facilities of each rail transit agency they oversee to perform inspections of infrastructure, equipment, records, personnel, and data. This authority can be derived from state law, executive order, or another vehicle. It is important that SSOAs review their legal authorities to ensure they can access the rail transit systems they oversee for inspections both with and without notice. If SSOAs do not have this authority, SSOAs will need to work with their state to ensure these authorities are granted. Legal authority can be tied to a state's legislative processes and timing. So FTA encourages SSOAs to review these authorities now and take appropriate action if necessary. Additionally, Congress has mandated that SSOAs work with their RTAs in 2 capacities for risk-based inspections. First, SSOAs must create policies and procedures in consultation with each RTA they oversee to conduct risk-based inspections with and without notice. Second, SSOAs must create policies and procedures in consultation with each RTA it oversees that ensure that rail transit agencies provide their SSOAs with the data that the RTA collects when identifying and evaluating safety risks. Both of the above policies and procedures must be codified in the SSOA's program standard. Lastly, rail transit agencies have a required role to play in risk-based inspections. As I mentioned earlier, Congress has mandated 2 specific policies and procedures that must be developed in consultation between the SSOAs and the RTAs. RTAs and SSOAs are required to build policies and procedures in consultation that address access to the rail transit systems so that risk-based inspections can be conducted both with and without advance notice. Additionally, RTAs and SSOAs must build policies and procedures in consultation that outline the specifics of data sharing. Under the law, each RTA must share with its SSOA the data it collects when identifying and evaluating safety risks. Similar to the requirements levied on the SSOA, which requires access and data sharing policies and procedures to be incorporated into the state's program standard, each RTA must incorporate access and data sharing policies and procedures into their agency safety plan. Now that we've discussed responsibilities, I'd like to talk about the timing of FTA's implementation of the risk-based inspection program. Congress provided a timeline for the implementation of the risk-based inspection program. First, FTA will issue special directives to each SSOA requiring the development and implementation of a risk-based inspection program, no later than 1 year following the enactment of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which is November 15th, 2022. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law requires that SSOAs implement their risk-based inspection program 2 years after the issuance of the special directive. You'll notice on this slide that FTA has used approximately November 15th, 2024 as the deadline for the SSOAs to implement their risk-based inspection program. I'd like to reiterate that the implementation date is tied to the date of FTA's issuance of the special directives, not to the specific date of November 15th, 2024. While FTA intends to issue the special directives no later than November 15th, 2022, a specific date for their issuance has not yet been determined. You'll see in the middle of this slide, projected 2023. In addition to the special directives that FTA must issue, FTA intends to incorporate risk-based inspection programs into an update of the State Safety Oversight Program that oversees rail transit safety. That regulatory update is projected to occur during 2023. While these 2 processes are very much related, the regulatory update is not intended to interfere with the requirements of the special directive, nor its implementation. We're going to transition from the requirements of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law into the approach FTA is taking to implement the risk-based inspection program. This will include the required special directive and a toolkit, similar to what FTA provided for certification several years ago. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about special directives, since most SSOAs and rail transit agencies have not yet received a special directive. First, FTA's authority to issue special directives is found in both the National Public Transportation Safety Program and the FTA's Special Directive Authority. Special directives are issued for a few prescribed reasons, including if the public interest requires the avoidance or mitigation of a hazard or risk. In this case, Congress is directing FTA to issue special directives for the purpose of developing and implementing risk-based inspection programs. Each special directive will include a statement of purpose and will include a description of the subject or issues to be involved. Importantly, for each SSOA to understand, the special directives will include a statement of the actions that the SSOA will be required to perform and will include both an effective date and a compliance date. At this time, FTA does not intend to share the special directives on the risk-based inspection program with the industry. However, FTA has issued several special directives in recent years and recently that are available publicly online so that SSOAs and RTAs can review, as an example, what is in a special directive. As we know, each SSOA will be issued a special directive on the development and implementation of risk-based inspections. FTA intends to fully address both the development and the implementation of risk-based inspection programs within the context of the special directive. Additionally, the special directives will be issued no later than November 15th of this year. Now I'd like to address how the special directives will be used to ensure that each program meets the requirements of the National Public Transportation Safety Program. As I mentioned earlier, the special directive will include a statement of actions being sought and a compliance date. For each required action, SSOAs will be required to submit documentation to demonstrate their risk-based inspection program meets those requirements. Once proper documentation has been submitted and FTA has verified that the SSOA's risk-based inspection program is compliant with the special directive and the National Public Transportation Safety Program, FTA will close the special directive by notifying the SSOA that all the requirements are satisfied and that the special directive is no longer open. As FTA issues the required special directives, FTA intends to release an accompanying toolkit to help SSOAs with the development and implementation of their risk-based inspection programs. This approach is intended to mirror the certification process and toolkit that FTA released prior to the certification requirements several years ago. In fact, the toolkit FTA intends to release for risk-based inspections was based on the format of the certification toolkit to provide SSOAs with a format that they're already familiar with. The risk-based inspection special directive that each SSOA will receive will be the binding document for each SSOA's risk-based inspection program. The risk-based inspection program toolkit will be a non-binding document that further explains the requirements of the National Public Transportation Safety Program and the special directive. The toolkit provides expanded background and information and is intended to assist SSOAs in complying with the special directive. The toolkit has been designed to align closely with the requirements of the special directive. We intend to release the toolkit at the same time as the special directives. Similar to the certification process, FTA has organized the risk-based inspection program into 6 distinct categories, which address specific requirements of risk-based inspections outlined by the National Public Transportation Safety Program. These components are SSOA authority to perform risk-based inspections, ensuring that risk-based inspections have proper policies and procedures, data sources and data collection, inspection prioritization, risk-based inspection practices that are commensurate with the number, size, and complexity of the rail transit systems each SSOA oversees, and ensuring that SSOAs have appropriate staffing, training, and qualifications. I'm going to take just a minute and expand on the categories of the risk-based inspection toolkit. However, this information that I'll provide next is still under FTA internal review and may be subject to change. Category 1 of the toolkit, the SSOA's authority to perform risk-based inspections, focuses on legal authority. The SSOA's program standard must clearly define the scope of the SSOA's access to each rail transit agency it oversees. A robust risk-based inspection program requires that SSOAs have the authority to access and inspect the full spectrum of activities at each transit agency. At a minimum, SSOAs must have the explicit authority to access transit agencies to inspect infrastructure, equipment, records, personnel, and data. Category 2 of the toolkit, risk-based inspections, policies, and procedures, focuses on the necessary policies and procedures for risk-based inspections. These policies and procedures should include detailed descriptions of the processes the SSOA will use to conduct inspections of each transit agency it oversees, both with and without advance notice. The SSOA may choose to develop policies and procedures tailored to each transit agency in its jurisdiction, or to develop overarching policies and procedures for multiple rail transit agencies, if that is more practical for the SSOA. These policies and procedures should address notifications to the rail transit agencies to conduct inspections with and without notice, access procedures and escorts, and access policies and procedures that encompass all distinct areas of a rail transit agency. Category 3 of the toolkit addresses data sources and data collection. A risk-based inspection program requires the collection and analysis of large sets of complex data and a mechanism for evaluating that data to inform inspection activities. The rail transit agencies must share safety data with the SSOA so that the SSOA can use the data sources as part of their risk-based inspection program. SSOAs, in consultation with each rail transit agency the SSOA oversees, must establish policies and procedures for collecting and sharing data. Category 4 of the toolkit addresses inspection prioritization. A risk-based inspection program requires that SSOAs prioritize inspection activity through data analysis. SSOAs can use the information derived from data analysis to guide the implementation of their risk-based inspection programs so that the highest risk conditions are addressed first. Data review and analysis should be done continuously so that changes within a transit system are reflected in the risk-based inspection programs. SSOAs should perform comprehensive data analysis of various types, including equipment, infrastructure, and practices specific to each transit system, incident verification, ongoing monitoring, including procedures, maintenance, and operations, defects and corrective or remedial action, and review of CAPs and safety risk mitigation verification. Category 5 of the risk-based inspection toolkit attempts to define the guidelines to ensure that SSOA's risk-based inspection program have practices that are commensurate with the number, size, and complexity of the rail transit systems the SSOA oversees. The SSOA must ensure that its system is, just one second. The SSOA must ensure that the risk-based inspection program it develops considers the number, size, and complexity of the agencies under its authority. While risk-based inspections should be frequent and consistent, not all transit systems share the same risk profile. The SSOA should tailor the scope of its inspection activities for each transit systems based on the size and complexity and the SSOA's safety prioritization activity. For example, the SSOA may implement a more robust inspection program at its multimodal transit agencies than at a single mode transit agency if collected data validates that decision. Similarly, if an SSOA oversees a transit agency that is less complex but has a higher level of safety risk due to known non-conformances with operational policies and procedures or poor safety culture, the SSOA may determine to prioritize more risk-based inspections at that agency in a particular year. Category 6 of the toolkit addresses the SSOA's capacity to conduct risk-based inspections, including SSOA staffing, training, and qualifications. Each SSOA must have sufficient staff and resources to conduct the risk-based inspection program. The staff must have the capacity to perform risk-based inspection program activity for each transit system it oversees in a manner commensurate with the size, number, and complexity of those systems. As states begin thinking about building the risk-based inspection programs, an area that I'd like to talk about is the method to transform data from the RTA's targeted and relevant inspection activities. Risk-based inspections start with data that must be transformed into prioritized inspection practices. The first step in inspection prioritization is to determine which safety metrics will be used. The SSOA must determine and incorporate into the program standard the specific safety metrics that SSOAs will use to prioritize inspections by evaluating relevant data. Relevant data includes data shared by the RTA, such as safety program data, maintenance data, and inspection data. SSOAs should perform comprehensive data analysis of the safety program metrics, and this analysis should inform SSOA risk-based inspection elements and practices. The second step in inspection prioritization is to develop prioritization procedures. The SSOA should establish methods to analyze the collected data to prioritize safety concerns for inspections. The SSOA can develop this prioritization methodology to meet the demands of its program. As part of this methodology, the SSOA would group elements into categories and then develop a corresponding prioritization score or rating. For example, the SSOA could rate vehicle maintenance risk by car or car series, depending on the available data. The score or rating of each category may be calculated differently and should be tailored to the specifics of both data collected and the specific category. The third step in inspection prioritization is to prioritize inspection activities within each transit agencies and between all transit agencies the SSOA oversees. The SSOA should develop policies and procedures that describe how to prioritize inspections for each rail transit agency it oversees and how it will inform each agency of the specific risk-based inspections. If an SSOA oversees more than one rail transit agency, the SSOA should also develop a procedure for clearly identifying and prioritizing safety concerns among the rail transit agencies. There should be clear documentation that relates safety concerns and prioritization analysis to the risk-based inspection activities. Data analysis and prioritization should be an ongoing process of collecting data, analyzing that data, developing prioritization ratings, and prioritizing inspections. SSOA should build inspections of equipment, infrastructure, and practices specific to each rail transit agency. Incident verification, ongoing monitoring, including procedures, maintenance, and operations, defects and corrective or remedial action, and caps and safety risk mitigation verification. At this time, I've concluded describing FTA's approach to the Special Directive and Toolkit. Now, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on where FTA's current assessment of the industry's readiness to implement risk-based inspection programs is, and areas where FTA is closely watching. This chart reflects FTA's assessment of SSOA's existing inspection programs and compares them to the requirements of the National Public Transportation Safety Program. The categories listed here are intended to reflect the components addressed in the earlier slide. As you all know, most SSOAs are already conducting some form of inspections on their rail transit agencies. However, FTA does not assess that the inspections are developed using a risk framework. Therefore, most SSOAs will be updating their programs to reflect these new requirements. I'd like to reflect on 3 of these categories. FTA assesses that most SSOAs have the legal authority to access rail transit agencies for the purpose of inspections. But FTA encourages every SSOA to verify that they have the authority to access their rail transit agencies for inspections both with and without notice now, because as I mentioned earlier, if updating this authority is necessary, it may require state legislative action. Second, FTA assesses that only 10% of SSOAs have an inspection program that is risk-based. FTA considers that this area will be the most transformative process change for SSOAs as they continue existing inspection programs. Third, I'd like to address staffing. FTA understands that implementing a risk-based inspection program may require agencies to hire additional staff depending on current staffing and level of inspections within an agency and based on additional requirements of the National Public Transportation Safety Program. As with certification, FTA intends to ensure that SSOAs have the resources to implement a risk-based inspection program, and our processes for assessing staffing will closely align to those used for certification. Lastly, FTA would like to acknowledge the current situation of SSOAs related to risk-based inspections and highlight a few areas for attention. FTA acknowledges the disruption that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused to transit agencies. In many cases, inspections of transit agencies were paused and are only now resuming. While this is a consideration, I'd just like to remind the group that full implementation of the risk-based inspection programs will not be required until approximately November of 2024. I'd like to turn it back over to Joe to lead the question and answer session and then wrap up today's webinar.
Great. Thanks for that presentation, Erin. Great job. And I hope everybody found that all that information informative. So we have a few questions we're going to run through that we got. And I'm going to start, Erin, with just a little bit about the time frame. So the time frame you mentioned earlier was November 15th, 2022. Will the special directive be issued on that day or will it be issued earlier?
Yep, thanks, Joe. That's a great question. So FTA is working to build the special directives and the toolkit, and we intend to issue the special directives no later than November 15th, 2022, but not before September 1st of this year.
Okay, great. And if a state already conducts a risk-based inspection program at the SSOA, will they still get a special directive?
Yes, all the SSOAs will receive a special directive with specific requirements that must be addressed. Once an SSOA has met the requirements of the special directive, the SSOA will submit verification to the FTA. And after FTA verifies a compliant program, FTA will close the special directive.
Okay, very good. And I just saw out of the corner of my eye a question come up about why we're doing this via a special directive versus a rulemaking. And I didn't know if you would just take a quick second to address that.
Joe, can you just repeat that question one more time?
Yeah, so the question came in about why are we doing a special directive versus a rulemaking? And my understanding, and just clarify with me and everyone, is that was the direction that was given in the statute. So we really didn't have any option.
Yep, absolutely. So it was actually in both places. So there was a requirement in the BIL that mandated that we issue a special directive. And then there was also a change to the language in which we need to update the regulatory process. So it's really a two-pronged process that I talked to before, but a special directive is a requirement and it will be issued no later than November 15th of this year.
Okay, perfect. Sorry for the curveball. Next question. Will an SSOA be required to hire additional staff? And we got a couple questions coming in on this, so I think your clarifications here will be appreciated.
Yep. So the answer is it depends on the current situation that your SSOA has. So SSOAs will be required to build a risk-based inspection program that is commensurate with the number, size, and complexity of the programs they oversee. That could mean adding additional manpower to an SSOA. There are a variety of ways to increase manpower, including hiring additional staff or increasing contract support. One thing to note is it is part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that was signed last year. Additional funding was allocated to SSOAs in conjunction with these new inspection requirements? So the answer, I guess for most SSOAs is it depends on your current program and how it aligns with the requirements of the special directive.
Yeah, great. And those are good conversations for the SSOA to have with their FTA program manager as well. So we're happy to help in that area. And back to this question of the rulemaking versus special directive a little bit, is there going to be any public comment period before the special directives are issued?
No, there will not be a public comment period before the special directive is issued. However, when the FTA updates CFR 674 to include inspections that are risk-based, that will be the time for public comment on risk-based inspections.
Okay, great. And what areas should an RTA be preparing for as they anticipate the launch of this risk-based inspection program?
Yep. So as I mentioned before a couple of times, RTAs will be required to build policies and procedures in consultation with their SSOAs that address both access and data sharing. And furthermore, these policies and procedures must be incorporated into each RTA's PTAS and each SSOA's program standard. RTAs and SSOAs should begin working together early to develop these policies and procedures because procedure development could take time and incorporation into the PTAS and program standards could also take time.
Gotcha. Okay. And when can someone at an RTA expect that their SSOA would begin risk-based inspections?
So SSOAs may already be conducting inspections or risk-based inspections, and FT encourages the continuation of these already ongoing activities. Risk-based inspection implementation meeting the requirements of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law are required to begin no later than 2 years after the issuance of the special directive to each SSOA, which, as I mentioned before, is approximated to be during the fall of 2024. However, SSOAs can begin implementing their programs earlier than the deadline.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you for that clarification. And can you just talk a little bit more about how risk-based inspections differ from standard inspections?
Yep. So the goal of risk-based inspection program is to use data to inform inspection practices and prioritization, really to help with limited inspection resources so that the highest risk elements and safety conditions are addressed first. The main difference between a risk-based inspection program and really what we've seen as a standard inspection program is the use of data to prioritize inspection activities, which addresses the highest risk elements first.
Gotcha. Okay, I appreciate that. And I'm just going to address just a couple of things that I see in the chat, and the other, if we can't get to other questions, you all can send those questions in to the email address that's up there on the screen, ftasso.docs@dot.gov. And just kind of in terms of theme of what I see in the chat, there's some questions about, what kind of support RTAs and SSOAs will get from FTA and on the resource issue. And I think kind of as a general statement to everyone, I would say, as we work through this process and as the special directive or issues and we begin implementation, we certainly are going to be working with the SSOAs and be available for the RTAs as well to try and answer any questions. This is a new program. We recognize that there will be questions that come up. The resource issue is the one that has come up the most, which was addressed here. And as Aaron mentioned, on the SSO side, there has been a significant amount of additional funding for the SSOs. And as this year has gone by, we already have been encouraging them to be looking at their resources as it relates to risk-based inspections. But also, I agree with the commenter who indicated that there could be some potential impacts on the RTA as well. So those are things that we certainly will work to and look to address. And hopefully when everyone sees the toolkit, that will help to answer some of the questions about what types of data, because it really depends on what you have available. Aaron, you gave a couple of examples of different ways where, depending on what kind of available data you have as an RTA, it could influence, how you make the decisions. And you also may identify gaps that you then need to look to fill. So more to come on that, and definitely will hope that the toolkit will help everybody be able to address that. So with that, we're at about time now. So again, I appreciate everybody and your attention today. So I hope we got most of your questions answered, but if not, again, please send them in. And thank you for joining us today, and please have a great afternoon. Thank you.